Imagine a time when a woman's orgasm was considered essential for conception, when public bathhouses were rumored hubs of scandal, and clergy wrote openly about sexual pleasure. To make sense of it all, we first need to explore how language shaped medieval views on morality, gender, and power. Today, terms like woman, lady, or prostitute carry clear meanings and strong emotions. Noble-born women were respectfully addressed as ladies, while ordinary women were identified by terms that later became derogatory, but were at the time neutral and descriptive. And what about those who sold sex? Depending on how and where they operated, these women were classified in remarkably diverse ways. Common women, regulated and supervised in city-sanctioned brothels, or free women, operating independently, with no legal protections, and thus exposed to constant risk. What might seem like subtle distinctions in terminology reveals profound divisions in medieval life, illustrating vividly who was protected or vulnerable, respected or condemned. This relationship between language and status lies at the heart of how medieval society viewed sex, gender, and morality. But these aren't just abstract concepts. They come to life when studied through human stories. One historical reenactor, for example, has dedicated herself to exploring the lived experience of prostitution in medieval Europe. While preparing for her role, she encountered a wealth of fascinating material, much of it rarely discussed in public. As her research deepened, she saw how little attention this topic receives and decided it was worth sharing with a broader audience. Her work offers insight into a part of medieval life that remains obscured and misunderstood. The popular modern image of the Middle Ages is dominated by the notion of an all-powerful church that suppressed all expressions of sexuality. This perspective paints the era as one shaped by shame, silence, and religious moralizing. But a close examination of primary sources reveals a more complex picture. While visual representations of sexuality are rare, something explored in depth through specialized study, the written records are surprisingly abundant and revealing. Sex and sexual behavior were embedded in everyday life and documented with striking openness in early Christian penitential books. These manuscripts served as guides for confession, offering priests detailed lists of questions to ask penitents. While they addressed familiar biblical sins, they also ventured into highly specific behavioral scenarios, particularly those of a sexual nature. These guides did not merely skim the surface. They asked pointed questions. Did you masturbate? Did you commit adultery? Did you entertain lustful thoughts? Did you kiss or touch someone who was not your spouse? Even specifying whether the partner was married to someone else. Ironically, these texts, crafted to encourage moral discipline, also function as valuable sociological records, providing a rare glimpse into the intimate dimensions of daily life. Many of these penitential texts were intended not just for lay people, but also for members of the clergy, monks, priests, and ecclesiastical leaders. Their pages contain not only moral admonitions, but also candid insights into the routines and temptations of monastic life. The influence of these texts spread across northern Europe and France, eventually reaching the German-speaking world. By the 12th century, however, their popularity began to wane, giving way to new genres of religious instruction. From that point onward, our understanding of medieval sexuality increasingly derives from scholarly religious writings and the sermons of prominent preachers. Figures such as Berthold of Regensburg and Heinrich von Langenstein addressed matters of sexuality with notable specificity. Their sermons not only articulated church doctrine, but also shed light on how moral teachings were understood and adapted by the general population. Through their works, we gain valuable insight into the evolving norms, taboos, and contradictions surrounding sexual behavior. Literary sources offer another dimension. Canonical works, such as the Decameron, the Roman de la Rose, the Carmina Burana, and the lyrical poetry of the Minnesinges, approached sexual themes in layered and often symbolic ways. These texts rarely spoke plainly. Instead, they used allegory, metaphor, and poetic euphemism. A rose plucked in a garden, for example, might represent something far more intimate. For readers attuned to the language of courtly literature, the meanings were unmistakable. A key turning point in European cultural history was the rise of the ideal of romantic love, a concept largely absent from classical antiquity. Known in medieval texts as minne, this new ideal emerged most clearly in the literature of courtly romance. These narratives often portrayed love outside the bounds of marriage, characterized by longing, temptation, and emotional intensity. In tales like Melusine, the seductive power of the female figure frequently disrupted the traditional Christian model of marriage, replacing it with one driven by passion and mystery. These stories used the language of love to approach the subject of sexuality without naming it. Through the lens of minne, authors explored physical intimacy under the guise of spiritual or emotional devotion. This literary maneuver made it possible to write about the body without confronting the taboo directly. In many ways, our modern notion of romantic love is rooted in these medieval constructions, a cultural invention that has shaped Western ideas of relationships ever since. Texts from this era often balanced seriousness with humor. The Decameron and carnival plays of the 15th century tackled sexual themes with wit, satire, and at times, vulgarity. These performances, especially popular in German-speaking regions, were typically held before Lent. They offered a brief period of levity, poking fun at societal norms and power structures. They were often staged by local citizens and reflected everyday life in both serious and subversive ways. Yet perhaps the most detailed and systematically recorded source of information on medieval sexuality comes from medical texts. Drawing on Greco-Roman foundations and Arabic medical knowledge, European scholars preserved and expanded upon a wide range of treatises. Among the most influential were works by Avicenna and Constantinus Africanus, whose ideas circulated widely in manuscript form throughout the Middle Ages. One of the best-known texts is the Trotula, a gynecological manual from the renowned medical school of Salerno. Another is De Secretis Mulierum, On the Secrets of Women, by the polymath Albertus Magnus. These books explored subjects such as menstruation, conception, pregnancy, childbirth, and sexual health. They also outlined remedies for infertility, loss of desire, and venereal diseases, topics that were not only medical but deeply intertwined with religious and moral concerns. Surprisingly, many contributors to this literature were themselves members of the clergy. Contrary to the assumption that the Church universally rejected sexual knowledge, these clerics often led the intellectual efforts to understand and manage human sexuality. For them, such knowledge was essential, not only to healing, but to the moral regulation of society. Much of the foundational medical knowledge taught at European universities during the Middle Ages was derived from Arabic and African scholarship. This information entered the continent primarily through translations carried out by dedicated scholars, often monks, clerics, or other members of religious institutions. These translators played an indispensable role in transmitting vast amounts of scientific, philosophical, and medical knowledge to the Latin-speaking world. While not all of it remained confined to church circles, much of it initially passed through ecclesiastical channels, which were often the only centers of learning with access to the necessary linguistic and manuscript resources. One significant challenge facing medieval medicine was the problematic legacy of antiquity. Classical sources, especially those of Galen, were revered, even when their content was flawed or based on questionable empirical methods. For example, Galen's understanding of female anatomy included the belief that the uterus contained multiple chambers, a notion he developed through dissecting pigs. Many medieval scholars likely suspected this was incorrect, yet quoting a widely respected figure such as Avicenna or Aristotle lent far more intellectual credibility than relying on personal observation or anecdotal evidence. This illustrates a broader feature of medieval intellectual culture. Until the advent of Renaissance humanism, scientific inquiry favored textual authority over empirical investigation. The wisdom of ancient and Islamic scholars was considered not just useful, but definitive. Consequently, medical and sexual knowledge was shaped for centuries not by experimentation, but by the prestige of tradition. The words of the ancients were not to be challenged. They were to be preserved and interpreted. Many of the texts at the heart of this intellectual inheritance were of Arabic origin, but this does not imply that observations about human sexuality were absent in local European contexts. Rather, the formalization and legitimization of such knowledge often required association with an authoritative figure. That distinction between folk knowledge and sanctioned scholarship is critical to understanding how medieval Europeans learned about the human body. Outside of scholarly and ecclesiastical literature, there are many other types of evidence that reveal how sexuality was perceived and represented in the Middle Ages. Illuminated manuscripts, for instance, often contain more than sacred imagery or biblical scenes. The margins of these manuscripts, known as marginalia, sometimes feature bawdy, absurd, or grotesque illustrations, including satirical depictions of sexual acts. Some of these images were clearly intended to amuse or provoke, suggesting that sexual humor existed across different levels of society. One notorious example includes depictions of individuals having comets inserted into their behinds, an image that says as much about the medieval imagination as it does about the limits of decorum. Importantly, many of the behaviors listed in penitential books were never actually prosecuted by secular authorities. The Church might have condemned certain acts as sins, but civil law didn't always follow suit. In fact, during most of the medieval period, religious and secular legal systems remained distinct. Unless an act disturbed public order or directly harmed another individual, it was often considered a private matter, outside the concern of city officials or magistrates. Nonetheless, there were regulations meant to keep certain behaviors visible and contained. For example, prostitutes were often required to wear identifying clothing, such as veils, colored bands, or specific garments, to distinguish them from respectable women. These dress codes helped visually enforce social hierarchies and moral expectations. They also served as tools of spatial control, reinforcing who belonged where within the urban landscape. City laws commonly designated specific districts where prostitution could occur. These regulated zones were sometimes limited to one or two streets or confined to the outskirts of the town. Brothels were licensed by the municipality, and legal documents detailed their management, ownership, and financial oversight. In some cities, brothels were even publicly owned, with income redirected into civic budgets, a pragmatic but often hypocritical arrangement. Archaeological discoveries further supplement the textual record. Phallic-shaped drinking vessels, carved graffiti with erotic imagery, and other sexual artifacts have been found in numerous medieval sites. Some of these carvings remain visible today, etched into the facades of centuries-old buildings. Personal letters, though rare, occasionally address sexual matters as well. One particularly revealing example is the erotic poetry of Gwerfyl Meccan, a Welsh noblewoman who composed candid verses celebrating female sexuality. In another case, Margrave Albrecht of Brandenburg once sent a letter to his wife joking crudely about the size of her maid's buttocks, proof that even the nobility sometimes abandoned propriety in private correspondence. Taken together, these sources form a complex mosaic. Our aim is to begin with the experiences that were most common, those that the average medieval person would have encountered, and then shift toward the more marginal or stigmatized, such as prostitution. This approach is not about judging moral behavior, but about recognizing which aspects were most prevalent in the source material. So what did ordinary people in the Middle Ages really know about sexuality? Modern assumptions are often shaped by the prudish norms of the 19th and 20th centuries, times when sexual knowledge was often suppressed, pathologized, or cloaked in euphemism. But the medieval world operated differently. Among the general population, there existed a surprisingly practical and experience-based understanding of sex. People knew what they needed to know to navigate their social roles, form families, and bear children. This knowledge was passed down informally through oral traditions, shared experiences, and community observation, not through formal instruction or written sex education. Fundamental facts, such as the link between intercourse and pregnancy, or the role of ejaculation in conception, were widely understood. These weren't mysteries. They were part of everyday life. Anyone who had been sexually active would have noticed the connection. It didn't take a university education to grasp the basics of reproduction. You may have heard claims, often repeated in modern documentaries, that medieval families slept 10 to a room and had sex openly in front of others. But such assertions are highly questionable. Even in modest homes, some degree of privacy would likely have been observed. While sounds may have traveled through thin walls or shared spaces, the act itself was usually concealed. Written sources suggest a strong sense of intimacy surrounding sexuality, an understanding that, despite its universality, it was a private matter not meant for public display. Families likely found subtle ways to preserve boundaries, even in cramped quarters. From an intellectual standpoint, medieval scholars were deeply engaged in theories of sex and reproduction. They may not have known more than we do today, but they invested considerable thought and effort in attempting to understand these subjects. Most of the medical texts from this period were built on the legacy of Aristotle, Hippocrates, Galen, and Soranus, ancient thinkers whose works continued to shape medical discourse for centuries. One of the most influential conceptual frameworks was the theory of the four humors. According to this view, the human body was composed of four basic fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, each associated with different qualities like heat, coldness, moisture, and dryness. Men were believed to be naturally hot and dry, while women were seen as cold and moist. This supposed opposition explained not only physical differences, but also emotional and behavioral traits. Sexual union, in this framework, was a moment of cosmic balance, when opposing elements temporarily harmonized to create life. Aristotle's theory of conception, rooted in ancient biological philosophy, described the process as the union of two vital bodily fluids. The male fluid was clearly semen, while the female contribution was believed to be menstrual blood, a substance expelled from the body if not used to create life. Within this framework, conception occurred when these two fluids combined inside the woman's body. Aristotle likened the process to cheese-making. The woman's fluid would curdle through the heat and power of the male seed, triggering the formation of a child. It was a metaphor grounded in daily observation, shaped by limited anatomical knowledge, and steeped in symbolic thinking. This model didn't remain a mere academic theory. It influenced a wide array of beliefs about how sex should be practiced. Scholars and physicians drew from it when advising on everything from optimal sexual positions to ensure conception, to the ideal length of the male organ, to what types of food should be consumed before intercourse. Detailed manuals and guides offered instructions on the proper conditions for reproduction. These prescriptions informed societal norms, religious expectations, and even private behaviors, shaping the notion of what constituted correct or healthy sex in a moral and biological sense. A striking example of this intersection between medicine and daily life is found in the Doctrine Sanitatis, a medieval health handbook derived from earlier Arabic texts. It included advice not only on food and exercise, but also on sexual activity. The handbook listed foods believed to promote the production of semen, often overlapping with what we would now call aphrodisiacs. It also warned against the dangers of excessive sex, suggesting dietary remedies to restore bodily balance. Within this framework, lust and semen were understood as intimately linked. To generate one was to evoke the other, and both were considered essential components of male fertility. One vivid account comes from Constantinus Africanus, a key translator of Arabic medical knowledge into Latin. He claimed that semen was formed in the brain, where the man's vital spirit liquefied before traveling down the spine, carrying the essence of life. Lust, he said, arose from a mix of bodily heat and moisture. Ideally, sexual union involved emotional satisfaction as well. True conception required fluids, harmony, and timing. To support this balance, medieval physicians proposed various remedies, mostly focused on men. Treatments aimed to boost desire and ensure semen delivery. Female fertility and pleasure, by contrast, received little attention. Responsibility for conception rested largely on the man, both physically and spiritually. This focus on male potency might seem surprising in a Christian context where celibacy and asceticism were valued. Yet medieval medical thought considered sex, especially within marriage, essential to health. Doctors even warned that prolonged abstinence could cause illness or imbalance. Two towering figures shaped Christian sexual ethics, Augustine of Hippo and Thomas Aquinas. Augustine, writing in the 4th and 5th centuries, viewed sex through the lens of original sin. He believed lust entered the world with Adam and Eve's disobedience. Before the fall, sex could have been rational and controlled. Afterward, it became tainted by desire. Even marital sex, he argued, was sinful unless aimed at procreation. His ideas were also shaped by ancient philosophy, which placed reason above bodily impulse. In this view, the soul should govern the flesh. Augustine's own conflicted experiences with sexuality, detailed in his writings, likely informed his theology. Centuries later, Thomas Aquinas built on Augustine's thought. Writing in the 13th century, he framed lust as a disorder of nature. While acknowledging sexual pleasure in marriage, he insisted it must serve procreation. Unchecked desire, he warned, led the soul astray. His teachings became core church doctrine for generations. This theological outlook also shaped early penitential literature. Confession manuals listed detailed sexual sins, reflecting the belief that sex, unless tightly regulated, posed moral danger. These views were echoed by generations of preachers urging purity and restraint. But how deeply did these ideals affect daily life? Records suggest many people didn't strictly follow church teachings. Still, the ideals shaped how they felt about their own behavior. Even when acts deviated from doctrine, guilt and shame often followed, evidence of how deeply moral expectations had been internalized. The distinction between good and bad sex was clearly defined. Good sex was marital, procreative, and performed without excessive indulgence. Bad sex was anything outside of that narrow definition, particularly acts motivated solely by pleasure or those considered unnatural. While certain allowances were made, for example, sex when a woman was unlikely to conceive, the Church still expected that every sexual act be open to the possibility of reproduction. This expectation influenced not just religious life but also broader societal norms. How much did people in the Middle Ages actually understand about fertility? There were certainly theories. Some texts discussed the idea of fertile days, but these notions bore little resemblance to what modern science has confirmed about the female reproductive cycle. Instead of ovulation, fertility was explained through humoral theory and the supposed balance of bodily fluids. Warmth, moisture, temperament, and diet were thought to influence a woman's readiness to conceive. While incorrect by today's standards, these ideas were taken seriously and shaped how couples approached reproduction. As we shift our focus from normative behaviors to more exceptional or marginalized experiences, it's important to remember that the most common setting for sex in the medieval world was within marriage, or at least within a socially recognized long-term partnership. Marriage itself was a flexible institution, evolving over time and varying widely depending on region, class, and local custom. But regardless of its legal or sacramental form, a stable union between a man and a woman was the expected context for sexual activity. When it came to boundaries, those invisible but deeply felt lines between what was acceptable and what crossed into sin, the concept of thought crimes became especially significant. These were not merely physical acts, but included intentions and desires that strayed from the Church's reproductive ideal. Practices that did not directly aim at conception, such as oral sex, mutual masturbation, or coitus interruptus, were considered sinful. All of these fell under the broad and morally charged label of sodomy, which also encompassed anal sex and sexual positions believed to inhibit procreation, such as rear entry positions or the woman being on top. The underlying concern was the waste of semen. Any ejaculation that occurred outside the woman's body, outside the narrow possibility of conception, was condemned. Semen, regarded as a vital and life-generating substance, was to be preserved and directed only toward its divine purpose, reproduction. Yet in spite of these prohibitions, a number of sources, both moral and medical, acknowledge that sexual pleasure and mutual enjoyment were integral parts of the act. Some texts even encouraged it. Manuals were written advising men on how to please their wives, not just physically, but emotionally. They offered guidance on how to speak gently, how to initiate affection with touch, and how to engage in forms of foreplay to ensure that the woman, too, experienced arousal. This recognition of female desire, while limited, was nonetheless present. The ancient physician Soranus of Ephesus even suggested that a woman's orgasm played a role in facilitating conception. Though the physiological mechanisms were poorly understood, the very idea that a woman's pleasure had a reproductive function was noteworthy. This wasn't mainstream knowledge, and it certainly didn't shape religious doctrine, but it found its way into both medical writing and anecdotal wisdom. One of the earliest recorded European descriptions of a female orgasm comes from Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century Benedictine abbess and mystic. She described the experience in physical and sensory terms, acknowledging it as a distinct and meaningful event. How she acquired this knowledge remains unknown, whether through observation, second-hand testimony, or spiritual insight. but her account is one of the few surviving medieval descriptions that recognize female pleasure as real and bodily. Even within the Church itself, some voices acknowledged a mutual dimension to marital sex. Berthold of Regensburg, a 13th-century preacher, taught that both spouses had responsibilities in the sexual act. The man, he argued, should seek to please the woman, and she, in turn, should be receptive. Sex wasn't just a means of reproduction. It was seen, at least by some, as a pathway to marital harmony and emotional unity. Still, any practice that departed from the ideal of penetrative, procreative sex was labeled sinful. But contrary to the popular image of an ever-watchful church looming over every bedchamber, enforcement of these rules was far from totalitarian. The church distinguished between degrees of sin. Non-standard positions or improper acts were often dealt with privately, through confession and penance. A few prescribed prayers or a brief period of reflection was usually sufficient. Public punishment was rare, reserved for what were considered more serious offenses. Penance, too, was layered. It could involve simple rituals of repentance, acts designed to realign the soul with divine order. Physical or legal consequences typically came into play only when broader societal norms were violated, such as in cases of public scandal, same-sex relations, or prostitution. These carried different social and theological weight. Penitential manuals and confessional guides do occasionally reference acts that deviated from church-sanctioned norms. These include anal sex, oral sex, the use of hands for stimulation, sex in unconventional places, and various sexual positions. The fact that such acts were even mentioned, however briefly, suggests that they occurred not just in brothels or marginal spaces, but in ordinary households as well. When we shift our focus to sexuality that existed outside conventional structures, such as homosexuality or alternative sexual practices, we begin to encounter rare but fascinating glimpses of behaviors we would today categorize as kink or fetish. One noteworthy example involves sex toys. References to dildos, while extremely scarce, do exist. Some documents speak of objects crafted or used for penetrative purposes, particularly within the context of prostitution. These instances were exceptional, but they hint at a broader range of sexual behavior than we might expect. Roleplay, too, makes a surprising appearance in the historical record. In one English account, prostitutes are described dressing as noblewomen to entice clients, often young tradesmen, apprentices, or journeymen. The fantasy at play was not just sexual, it was social. It allowed men of lower status to imagine themselves as the temporary equals or even superiors of aristocratic women. The act of playing noble blurred class boundaries and added layers of fantasy and power reversal to the encounter. Cross-dressing also appears in several regional records, particularly in Italy. Women who dressed in men's clothing were seen as especially provocative. Tightly fitted hose or trousers emphasized the legs and buttocks, areas normally concealed under long dresses. These visual cues challenged traditional gender norms and made the female body more visible and, by extension, more eroticized. In other cases, men presented as women, sometimes for performative purposes, other times for sexual ones. The example of John Reichener, a male-bodied individual who dressed as a woman and reportedly had sex with men who believed he was female, is among the most famous documented cases of gender nonconformity in late medieval England. Another rare but revealing case from the 16th century, technically beyond the medieval period, describes a client paying to be beaten prior to intercourse. At the time, it was unusual enough to be recorded, but not so unthinkable as to be ignored entirely. As the Middle Ages progressed, One surprising trend emerged with growing frequency: the removal of pubic hair. Illustrated manuscripts and other visual sources increasingly show women depicted without body hair. This was not a universal practice, but in many contexts, especially among the upper classes, hairlessness became associated with beauty, youth, and refinement. Instructions for hair removal existed. They included steam baths, manual plucking, trimming, shaving, and even early forms of waxing. Some of these services were performed by women on society's margins, brothel workers, for instance, or Jewish women who offered specialized body care services. Historical sources mention women seeking these treatments in hopes of making themselves more attractive to men, aspiring to match the contemporary aesthetic ideal. Evidence of this trend appears even in public sculpture. A carving on the facade of a cathedral shows a woman bending over, using large shears, resembling sheep shears, to trim her pubic hair. The image is grotesque, but also very public, suggesting that the practice was common enough to be depicted without scandal. Its very visibility tells us something about how normalized the act had become in certain circles. Looking at female bodies in late medieval art, especially from the 15th century onward, one notices an almost complete absence of pubic hair. Some scholars trace this aesthetic shift to the period of the Crusades. It's possible that Frankish knights, encountering grooming customs in the Islamic world, brought those practices back to Europe. Alternatively, hair removal may have persisted independently in the Mediterranean world, rooted in Greco-Roman antiquity, and passed along through cultural continuity. Regardless of its exact origins, by the late Middle Ages, pubic hair removal was both a visual and social signal. It was not just about appearance, it intersected with beliefs about health. According to humoral theory, menstruation served as a means for the female body to purge toxins. If this process failed, it was believed toxins would be released in the form of excess hair. A smooth, hairless body thus became a sign of physiological balance, of a properly functioning, youthful, and fertile body. Hair removal in the Middle Ages extended far beyond the pubic region. It often included the armpits, legs, and facial hair, and in some cases, full-body grooming was practiced. This was not just a female concern. The male body, too, was subject to evolving ideals of cleanliness and attractiveness. Medieval texts and illustrations reference beard trimming, chest hair removal, and even stylized body hair grooming among men. In the Arabic-speaking world, full-body grooming was framed as both a hygienic practice and a cultural preference. These standards, especially concerning female grooming, were likely influential in shaping similar habits across medieval Europe. Whether these practices emerged independently within Europe or were inherited from Greco-Roman traditions is difficult to determine. Hair removal was certainly present in ancient Roman society, and it's likely that aspects of that culture persisted through the centuries. What is clear is that by the High and Late Middle Ages, body hair removal, especially among the upper classes, had become both a social signal and a sensual aesthetic. This brings us to one of the more intimate and rarely discussed aspects of medieval sexuality: the use of sexual aids and erotic accessories. While we've already touched on sex toys, there is further evidence suggesting a broader interest in visual and tactile stimulation, especially through clothing. Although we don't find explicit mentions of lingerie in the modern fetishistic sense, we do have archaeological and textual clues pointing to undergarments designed to titillate. A prime example comes from Lengberg Castle in Austria, where archaeologists unearthed linen undergarments from the 15th century. Some of these pieces were intricately decorated with sprang weaving and needle lace, highly detailed embellishments that would have been invisible to the public eye. These were not functional flourishes, They were crafted for someone who would see the garments in private, most likely a spouse or lover. In other words, these garments had erotic intent. Textual sources also describe how the sight of a person in intimate clothing could provoke desire. Men and women alike responded to glimpses of skin, fabric, and movement beneath light garments. Some clothes were deliberately designed to enhance physical features, sleeveless bathhouse dresses that accentuated the breasts, or fitted bodices that lifted and shaped the chest. In comedic plays and illustrated bathhouse scenes, women are often shown reacting with visible desire upon seeing muscular laborers in simple loincloths, called brooch. Conversely, men are portrayed responding to glimpses of women in loose, sheer fabrics. These depictions reflect a shared visual culture in which clothing was more than practical. It was erotically charged. Aphrodisiac ingredients often included spicy or warming substances, black pepper, saffron, ginger, cardamom. Foods believed to strengthen the body, such as eggs, red meat, and rich milk products, were also included, under the belief that bodily vigor translated directly into sexual potency. Even legumes like beans and lentils, despite their association with flatulence, were considered useful for stoking the internal fires of desire due to their warming nature in humoral theory. Interestingly, while men were encouraged to boost their desire, women were often treated with the opposite goal in mind. Remedies were offered to calm their passions, particularly in the context of preserving marital stability. A woman whose sexual appetite exceeded that of her husband was seen as a potential source of discord or even spiritual danger. But not all approaches to love and sexuality were herbal or medical. Magic played a significant role in the emotional and erotic landscape of the Middle Ages. Contrary to modern stereotypes, magic was not automatically equated with heresy or evil. There was a recognized distinction between natural or white magic, seen as working with divine or natural forces, and black or demonic magic, which was condemned. In fact, clerics themselves occasionally engaged with magical texts, and some wrote treatises on the subject without facing censure. Even Thomas Aquinas, one of the pillars of Christian orthodoxy, discussed magical influences in his writings. A famous painting in Leipzig shows a love spell in action, a ritual performed over a symbolic heart using precise gestures. This type of love magic was widely known and surprisingly common. One popular method involved weaving a strand of a woman's hair into a man's shirt to bind him emotionally. These rituals were rarely framed as malicious. In many cases, they were considered charming, sometimes literally, and part of a woman's cultural toolkit for securing affection or loyalty. Collections of so-called women's wisdom texts contain many such spells and remedies. One notable example appears in the Distaff Gospels, a body of vernacular folklore attributed to women's domestic conversations. In one spell, a woman is instructed to place a walnut leaf, picked on the feast of St. John, into her shoe in order to attract the love of a specific man. These spells functioned more as folk customs than occult practices, and in many cases were treated with playful seriousness rather than suspicion. Men, too, were known to use love magic, and legal records contain evidence of spells cast in both directions. Some medieval laws even recognized magical coercion as a legitimate cause for annulling a marriage. If it could be shown that a love spell had influenced someone's decision to marry, that union could be declared void, and the victim entitled to compensation. This legal approach treated love magic as a form of emotional fraud or manipulation rather than a mystical offense. Love spells were not officially encouraged, yet they were acknowledged as powerful and potentially dangerous tools in the social fabric. Perhaps most surprising is the degree to which medieval culture also grappled with contraception. Contraceptive knowledge was often embedded in broader discussions of reproductive health, menstrual regulation, or pregnancy management. The line between contraception and early-stage abortion was blurry, both in practice and in the texts. Remedies described as menstrual correctives or womb cleansers sometimes had dual purposes, preventing implantation or inducing miscarriage. Many of these sources are preserved in medical writings shaped by Arabic tradition. The phrasing is often careful, but the meaning is clear. Some begin without hesitation, "If the woman does not wish to bear the child," followed by detailed instructions. These ideas weren't whispered in the shadows. They moved through universities and monasteries hand to hand. Most of these methods relied on herbal substances, considered the most reliable tools available. Common ingredients included rue, pennyroyal, wild carrot, mugwort, juniper, willow bark, galangal, and betony. These herbs could be brewed into teas or infused into wine and honey mixtures. Others were applied directly as vaginal suppositories. Their effectiveness was unpredictable, and their safety highly questionable. Many of the herbs used are toxic. Some can cause severe cramping, organ failure, or death. Modern listeners should be warned. These practices are extremely dangerous and must not be attempted. If taken early enough, these herbal preparations might have prevented implantation. If taken later, they were meant to induce miscarriage. Either way, they were risky and often reserved for women with few other options: prostitutes, unmarried women, or those without access to sanctioned medical care. The existence of these texts, however, proves that knowledge about controlling fertility did exist, and that it was actively sought out and transmitted. Occasionally, medieval sources mention mechanical contraceptive methods, though these references are rare and somewhat ambiguous. Items like sponges or sticky pastes were reportedly applied to the cervix as barriers, possibly intended to block sperm from entering the uterus. But these methods appear only sporadically, suggesting they were either uncommon in practice or considered too risky due to concerns over hygiene. Infections and internal injuries were real dangers, and many would have been hesitant to insert foreign objects into the body without proper sanitation. Interestingly, love spells themselves were sometimes used with contraceptive intent. Amulets filled with symbolic or magical ingredients, such as weasel testicles, dried herbs, bones, or plant resins, were tied to the body, believed to either prevent conception or bring about miscarriage. Some rituals included prayers or invocations to saints, not to bless a union, but to ensure that pregnancy did not occur. These rituals combined elements of magic and medicine, but their purpose was clear: fertility control through both symbolism and practical action. As mentioned earlier, knowledge of fertility cycles in the Middle Ages did not align with what we now know from biology. Methods like rhythm tracking or calendar-based timing were rudimentary at best. People often misunderstood the female cycle, and ovulation itself was not yet recognized. Consequently, coitus interruptus, the withdrawal method, became the most widely practiced and most frequently condemned technique. Religious texts railed against it for one core reason: the waste of semen, which was believed to carry the full potential for life. By spilling it outside the womb, a man was thought to violate the divine order. Some sources also refer to extreme and mechanical attempts to induce abortion. These methods are not just alarming, they were often fatal. They included physically violent actions, such as pushing women downstairs, striking the abdomen, or applying dangerous levels of pressure to the stomach. Tragically, many women died as a result. The dangers were well known even at the time. Medieval manuscripts explicitly warned against such practices, not only because of the moral implications, but due to the severe medical risks. If embryonic tissue was not fully expelled, infections could spread rapidly. Septicemia and internal trauma claimed countless lives, silent tragedies in a world with limited medical intervention. Shifting focus now to prostitution, an area that appears frequently and vividly in medieval sources. It was a subject of fascination, regulation, moral commentary, and even practical urban management. While prostitution certainly occurred in rural areas, the bulk of documented cases come from urban environments, where the density of population and administrative oversight made such activities more visible and more likely to be recorded. We can broadly distinguish three major forms of prostitution in the Middle Ages: municipally regulated brothels, freelance prostitution, and concubinage. One challenge in studying prostitution during this period is that it was not legally defined as a distinct profession. A woman who had sex frequently outside of marriage could be labeled a prostitute even without receiving money. The line between moral disapproval and legal categorization was thin, and definitions were fluid. Before continuing, a note on terminology. Although in modern contexts the term sex work is often preferred for its neutrality and agency, we intentionally use prostitution here. The historical reality of medieval prostitution was overwhelmingly exploitative. There was no framework for consent, rights, or self-determination. Most women in this environment were economically vulnerable, socially marginalized, and operating under conditions that offered little protection or empowerment. Moreover, services that today fall under the umbrella of sex work, such as escorting, sexual assistance, or remote cam work, did not exist. Prostitution at the time almost always referred to direct, physical sexual service. Complicating the definition further, financial compensation wasn't always monetary. A woman could be considered a prostitute if she exchanged sex for shelter, protection, food, clothing, or social status. These forms of transactional sex were especially common among women without family support or access to formal employment. The most visible and regulated form of prostitution was the municipal brothel. In these institutions, sex was exchanged for money under a controlled, city-sanctioned framework. But concubinage offers an important counterpart. In many ways, it resembled a long-term partnership. A concubine might live with her partner, share in his social life, and receive housing, gifts, and clothing. In noble circles, this could blur even further into semi-official relationships. Morganatic or left-handed marriages, for example, allowed aristocratic men to form unions with women of lower status while preventing the children from inheriting titles or property. In the later Middle Ages, this ambiguity became even more pronounced. By the 16th century, it was often expected, particularly for rulers and high-ranking clergy, to maintain a mistress. Even ecclesiastical princes, such as Albrecht of Brandenburg, Archbishop and Elector of Mainz, openly kept concubines and fathered children with them. These relationships were known to the public and tolerated, if not celebrated. While we do not see this level of normalization in the High Middle Ages, the roots were already present. For urban authorities, prostitution presented both a moral dilemma and a logistical challenge. On one hand, it was considered sinful. On the other, it was seen as a necessary outlet for male desire, an unfortunate but inevitable reality that needed to be managed, not eliminated. This led to increasing regulation, especially in cities where civic order and public morality were intertwined. One common approach was to impose clothing regulations. Prostitutes were often forbidden from wearing garments associated with honest women. Special rules required visible markers, distinctive clothing, accessories, or altered garments to signify their status. While popular lore claims that prostitutes universally wore yellow, this is a myth. Although some towns mandated yellow veils or headscarves, others used red, blue, or striped fabric. In some places, prostitutes were required to turn their garments inside out or wear distinct aprons, hats, or badges. The specifics varied from one town to another, and regulations often changed over time. Another form of containment came through the establishment of city-licensed brothels, institutions funded or authorized by local governments. These buildings were sometimes donated by wealthy citizens or constructed with municipal funds. The city would appoint a manager, responsible for overseeing the facility, collecting fees, and enforcing rules. While many early managers were male, often chosen for their legal or financial expertise, by the 15th and 16th centuries, women increasingly took on these roles. In some cities, even the town executioner held management rights, not as a reflection of his duties, but because managing a brothel was lucrative and legally privileged. The right to manage a brothel was highly sought after. It offered income through rent, commissions, and food sales. Applicants lobbied for the position, sometimes using bribes or political influence. Once in control, the manager was expected to provide the women with clothing, rooms, and meals, but the women had to pay for everything. Fees were deducted from their earnings, and in many cases, women found themselves in deep debt. Complaints about exploitation, mistreatment, and never-ending financial obligations appear in multiple sources. The structure was deeply exploitative, but also institutionalized. These establishments were not hidden operations. They were public, regulated, and in some cities, even advertised. City authorities maintained them not out of support for sex workers, but to preserve public order and reinforce class hierarchies. Life inside these municipal brothels was far from easy. Conditions were generally poor. The women had little autonomy, and many were caught in cycles of debt or exploitation. Mistreatment was common, and opportunities for social mobility or long-term income were rare. Yet ironically, compared to independent sex workers who operated outside official institutions, brothel workers sometimes enjoyed a marginal degree of structure and legal protection. At the very least, they were acknowledged by the authorities and provided with some degree of oversight, however limited and often self-serving that oversight may have been. Societal perception of these women was deeply conflicted. On the one hand, they were classified as moral outsiders, sinners who existed on the margins of Christian respectability. On the other, they were tolerated and even seen as necessary, particularly in urban centers. City governments understood that large populations of unmarried men required an outlet for sexual desire, and public brothels were a way to channel that energy in a controlled manner. Interestingly, married men were often officially banned from visiting brothels, as were clerics. The institutions were intended primarily for bachelors, a demographic that made up a significant portion of medieval urban populations. Surprisingly, prostitutes were occasionally invited to participate in public celebrations in non-sexual roles. During civic events or ceremonial visits by dignitaries, they might be asked to dance, entertain, or even help with hospitality. These moments of participation offered a kind of conditional visibility. Prostitutes were present, but not acknowledged as equals. Their presence was normalized but limited, always framed by societal boundaries. One of the starkest contrasts between the Middle Ages and later centuries lies in the treatment of fallen women. In the 19th and 20th centuries, a woman who had engaged in sex work was often permanently stigmatized, socially erased. The medieval world took a more pragmatic and, in some cases, more forgiving view. Redemption was not only possible, it was theologically supported. Within Christian teaching, every sin could be forgiven through confession, penance, and genuine remorse. In several towns, charitable organizations collected donations to provide dowries for former prostitutes, enabling them to marry and re-enter society. With a dowry, a woman could dramatically change her prospects. Once married, her past was often set aside, especially if her new husband accepted her history. In some cases, women joined religious orders dedicated to helping others leave sex work. These communities provided shelter, spiritual guidance, and pathways to begin again, especially for aging women who could no longer work in the trade. Such practices were rooted in the belief that salvation was always attainable. No one was beyond God's mercy. The contrast with modern times is notable, where societal judgment often outweighed religious forgiveness. In the Middle Ages, a former prostitute who repented could become a nun, a wife, or a respected member of her community. The road was difficult, but not closed. Outside of municipal brothels, free women, independent sex workers, operated without official sanction. These women had no protections, no legal backing, and no stable income structure. Their independence came with extreme risk. Authorities were quicker to prosecute them, and they were more vulnerable to violence and exploitation. Ironically, this also made them more appealing to some married men seeking discretion. Unlike public brothels, where a man's presence could be noticed, free women offered privacy. As long as they weren't caught, these encounters often went unpunished. This didn't mean such behavior was accepted by everyone. Wives occasionally reported their husbands' infidelities to local officials, but these complaints rarely led to meaningful consequences. For the most part, civic authorities viewed prostitution as a form of pressure release, a necessary vice that helped maintain social stability. As long as it didn't disturb public order, it was tolerated. But this tolerance had limits. If a prostitute was accused of another crime, such as theft, fraud, or violence, her occupation was immediately used against her. Court records reveal harsher penalties for women labeled as prostitutes. Their social positions stripped them of credibility. A woman with a history of sex work was already seen as outside the bounds of respectability, and the legal system often punished her more severely for the same offenses committed by others. Bathhouses offer another important dimension to this history, and also a cautionary tale about historical interpretation. A persistent modern myth suggests that medieval bathhouses doubled as brothels. This misconception stems from a limited set of illustrations, all derived from variations of a manuscript tradition tied to Valerius Maximus, a Roman author who critiqued moral decay in ancient Rome. These 15th-century images, although visually compelling, depict Roman, not medieval settings. Nonetheless, they are frequently and inaccurately cited as evidence for medieval sexual practices. In reality, most medieval bathhouses were strictly regulated. While erotic undertones may have existed, for example the trope of the flirtatious bathhouse maid, this was the exception, not the norm. These establishments were neighborhood institutions where nudity, while present, was culturally desexualized through routine and familiarity. Just as modern saunas or nude beaches operate under social norms that define acceptable behavior, medieval bathhouses followed local customs and rules. Open sexual activity was generally prohibited and considered disruptive. Visitors came to bathe, socialize, and relax, not to indulge in scandal. Returning once more to prostitution, our clearest sources come from cities. Rural sex work certainly existed, but it is far less documented. In towns, prostitution took multiple forms: regulated brothels, informal arrangements, and long-term concubinage. These structures overlapped, and boundaries were often unclear. There was no standardized legal category for prostitution. A woman could be labeled a prostitute for having multiple sexual partners outside of marriage, regardless of whether money ever changed hands. As emphasized earlier, we use the term prostitution here deliberately because the historical conditions of the trade were overwhelmingly exploitative. There was no viable framework for consent or self-empowerment. The activity was narrow, physical, and closely tied to economic hardship or lack of options. Concubinage, by contrast, often resembled a personal arrangement. The woman might receive food, clothing, shelter, and some level of protection. In some cases, her social standing improved, though she lacked the legal status of a wife. Among the nobility, these relationships could take the form of morganatic marriages, where the union was recognized, but the woman and any children were excluded from inheritance. These arrangements could exist alongside official marriages, especially if the man wielded enough power. The church, though nominally opposed, often turned a blind eye when politics or status demanded it. By the early modern period, such relationships were expected among powerful men. Mistresses became common in princely courts, even among high-ranking clergy. Albrecht of Brandenburg, the Elector of Mainz and Archbishop, maintained several concubines and fathered children with them. Far from scandalous, this was considered ordinary among elites. Some mistresses even rose to positions of power. In France, the royal court institutionalized the role of maîtresse en titre, or official royal mistress. Louis XIV's lovers wielded influence and were sometimes elevated to nobility. The boundary between mistress, concubine, and prostitute became increasingly fluid, and sources from the time reflect that ambiguity. Legal distinctions blurred, moral ones shifted with convenience. Urban authorities responded to this complexity with regulation. Sumptuary laws targeted appearance, dictating what prostitutes could wear, which colors or fabrics were forbidden, and what identifying markers they had to display. These included striped garments, special caps, colored veils, or sashes. The goal was not just visibility, but containment, keeping sex work in its place, both physically and symbolically. There are powerful accounts of women trying to escape prostitution, an important reminder that any romanticized view of medieval sex work is deeply misleading. For most, it was not a choice, but a path shaped by coercion, poverty, and lack of alternatives. Efforts to leave were often blocked by structural barriers, legal, economic, and social. One of the more visible tools used to maintain control was clothing regulation. Prostitutes and women in comparable roles, such as concubines, were often legally barred from wearing luxury fabrics and accessories. Furs, gold, fine silks, and elaborate adornments were forbidden to them. Although these laws appeared to target prostitutes specifically, their real function was to safeguard the visual privileges of respectable women. For example, the wife of a respected citizen wanted clear visual distinction between herself and those seen as morally suspect, or even just socially inferior. The message was clear. Clothing signaled status, and disreputable women were not permitted to blur those lines. It wasn't about affordability. Even if a prostitute had the means to buy fine garments, she was denied the right to wear them. Fashion became a form of social control. We now arrive at one of the most complex and sensitive aspects of medieval sexuality, what today we refer to as identities. In medieval records, this primarily meant male homosexuality, as other identities, such as lesbian relationships or gender non-conforming lives, were rarely documented and often dismissed as irrelevant or invisible by authorities. Ironically, many of the references to homosexuality appear in legal documents, especially those involving prostitution or marginal individuals. These cases reflect not an open concern with same-sex relationships per se, but rather a willingness to investigate and punish those already viewed as outsiders. Once a person fell outside the accepted norms, socially, sexually, or economically, they were more vulnerable to prosecution. Male clients seeking same-sex encounters often used brothels and liminal social spaces to find anonymity. The authorities' focus remained on those who could be easily targeted, people with no legal protection, family backing, or public standing. Female same-sex relationships, in contrast, were generally ignored. The prevailing view was that without penetration, real sex hadn't occurred. As a result, even into the early modern period, many such relationships went unpunished, not because they were accepted, but because they were not taken seriously. This reveals a deeper cultural logic. Sex was defined primarily by its connection to reproduction. If no male organ was involved, then the reproductive order, and thus the social structure, was perceived as intact. Male homosexuality, however, directly challenged that order. Particularly troubling to medieval authorities was the idea of a man becoming a woman, that is, occupying a passive or penetrated role. Such reversals of gender hierarchy were viewed as violations of nature. Yet medieval society was rife with contradictions. Elite knights are described in chronicles and illustrated in manuscripts as kissing on the mouth, embracing, sleeping in shared beds, or walking arm in arm. The Codex Manesse, a celebrated 14th century manuscript, portrays men in long robes with gentle features, images that to modern viewers appear distinctly androgynous or even feminine. But these figures were tournament champions and aristocratic warriors, not marginalized courtiers. This challenges our modern instincts to read all male intimacy as inherently erotic. At the time, such behavior could be viewed as expressions of loyalty, brotherhood, or noble virtue, unless scandal or conflict brought it under scrutiny. Indeed, if a relationship caused no public disruption or moral outrage, it was often ignored. But when same-sex intimacy crossed legal or social thresholds, particularly when it challenged gender roles or public order, it became a target for prosecution. In the case of female intimacy, while fewer records survive, we do know of long-term female partnerships. In some towns, women lived together for decades in shared households, relationships that may have included romantic or sexual elements, but which were rarely labeled or investigated unless brought into public controversy. There are, however, rare but explicit accounts. One of the most well-known is that of Katharina Hetzelsdorfer, who was convicted in 15th century Nuremberg for having sexual relationships with multiple women. According to court testimony, she dressed in male clothing and used a wooden phallus during intercourse. Her crime was not simply same-sex activity, but the assumption of a male sexual role which violated both gender and sexual boundaries. She was executed. The same blurring of gender roles contributed to the persecution of other figures. Joan of Arc's choice to wear male clothing was among the charges brought against her. Helena Reiner, another woman accused of both cross-dressing and engaging in sex with men and women, was eventually drowned. An execution tied not just to her behavior, but to the social transgression of performing maleness. Such tragic cases are rare, not because the phenomena were rare, but because only capital punishment left clear traces in legal archives. The fact that some prostitutes reportedly offered same-sex services strongly suggests that demand existed. The absence of widespread documentation likely reflects deliberate silence, not lack of presence. Throughout the later Middle Ages and into the early modern period, sexuality was regulated not through a consistent moral code, but through a shifting network of legal, religious, and social responses. Public behavior was framed by rigid expectations, marital fidelity, clerical celibacy, and sexual roles tied to lineage and inheritance. Yet beneath these norms, everyday realities were far more complex. Court records, medical accounts, sermons, and personal testimonies reveal a society constantly negotiating the boundaries of what was acceptable, tolerable, or punishable. Throughout the later Middle Ages and into the early modern period, sexuality was regulated not through a consistent moral code, but through a shifting network of legal, religious, and social responses. Public behavior was framed by rigid expectations, marital fidelity, clerical celibacy, and sexual roles tied to lineage and inheritance. Transgressions were rarely judged by sexual acts alone. Rather, they were evaluated based on visibility, social rank, and perceived disruption to established hierarchies. In this framework, actions that threatened the symbolic order, such as cross-dressing, same-sex intimacy, or defiance of marital roles, became flashpoints for disciplinary measures. But enforcement was neither universal nor automatic. It was selective, often strategic, and shaped by context, a mixture of theology, rumor, and pragmatic calculation. Ultimately, medieval sexuality cannot be reduced to oppression or freedom, repression or expression. It operated within a dynamic and often contradictory framework, where theological ideals collided with lived realities, and where power was exercised not only through punishment, but also through silence, accommodation, and negotiation.